A couple days ago, French candidate Yannick Jadot just came up on the Twitch platform. It's not the first to do so, and we see that politics and social media are more linked than ever. And the guy who set the trend was of course Donald Trump, and his 17 tweets a day. As a reminder, Trump was at first a businessman. So how did a total outsider to the American political establishment, with no party or real structure to help him mobilize voters, a guy who was even in conflict with the leader of the Republican Party at the beginning of this campaign, has been elected 45th President of the United States? Sébastien MORT studied the question for a few years now, and he's here today with us. Good morning, Mr. MORT. Could you please introduce yourself?
All right, good morning. So I'm Sébastien MORT. I'm Associate Professor of American Culture and Society at l'Université de Lorraine in Metz, France. And my field of specialization is the intersection between politics and the media, and more specifically, the intersection and the relationship between the Republican Party, the conservative movement, and the mainstream news media. And I also work on conservative media, the conservative media ecosystem, with a focus on conservative talk radio.
Very well, so today we'll be focusing on how he used media, starting with how he did to become the media character he is.
Thanks to his tweet, Trump was able to control the debate, and so he can set the agenda of the media. Indirectly, this helped him in his campaign. In fact, the media put him a lot of time in first page during his campaign, and so for free. This means that he didn't have to pay for his political ad, and that he get time for free to spread his messages. So what should have done the media, especially the democratic one and the neutral one?
You mean in the election? I think what they should have done is to have refrained from taking Trump literally and to systematically focus on the outrageous comments and to take him more seriously as a political candidate, and to analyze what was the phenomenon that was happening in the field among the population. Because what is important to understand is that Trump is the symptom of a series of systemic problems that the country is facing. And so what the media did overall is to focus on the show, to focus on the spectacle, and to participate in amplifying the spectacle instead of focusing on the issues that allow us to explain why there is a Trump phenomenon.
A Trump phenomenon that goes through a distinctive rhetoric. Indeed, he's an authoritarian leader, and this kind of attitude involves having enemies. Obviously political, but in the case of Trump, the mainstream media are presented as enemies to the same extent as the Democrats. And there we have a media bullying. He threatened them several times to revoke their license, which is of course almost impossible, and by always challenging their trustworthiness, he neutralized their capacity to hold him accountable for his decisions. Politicians and media being adversarial is healthy for democracy in general, but here we are in a conflictual relationship, and we find ourselves talking far much about polemics than real political actions. But journalists also get into his game, so could you explain us in what way?
Yes, so first of all, you're right to say that some journalists do. Not all journalists do. Usually journalists from newspapers of record, so the New York Times or Washington Post, they try to stay away from these conflicts, and they do not engage when Trump tries to make them join the fight. But you're perfectly right to say that some other journalists, and particularly journalists from cable networks such as CNN or MSNBC, those journalists, some of them tend to actually engage with them. And so it's not only Trump attacking them to antagonize them and to fuel this fight with the press, but it's also some journalists responding to that and being complicit, in fact, in this phenomenon. So it is pretty. It's rather obvious when you look at what Jim Acosta does, for instance, And Jim Acosta is very happy to get into a fight with President Trump because it means that people will talk about him. It means that he will be on television. It will be noticeable. There's a shock value to that, to see that very brutal confrontation. And the reason why Trump does this is to humiliate journalists publicly and to stage the humiliation and inflict symbolic violence on journalists in order to signal to his supporters that he's on their side in the fight against the press. But of course, the problem is that when people like Jim Acosta respond, well, they only keep the fight going. And it means that we don't talk about the issues, but what we talk about during these press briefings is how the media treat Trump and how Trump treats the media, and we completely forget about the real issues. And of course, this is very profitable. It's very bankable for these journalists to fuel the fight, because then they can write books, they have very lucrative book deals, they appear on television, and so that's how they keep their brand going.
And here comes the paradox, because he appears as a strong leader, but also as a victim of the mainstream media. And that served him well, because it helped him a lot to spread his ideas.
However, Trump do not have only enemies. In fact, a large number of conservative medias are his allies. The most influential of them was Limbaugh with his talk radio, but nowadays we must talk about Fox News. The aim of this media is to create scandal, fuel hysteria and a feeling of indignation with the audience. To do so, the media use different strategies, especially sensationalism, exaggeration, character assassination, as well as hyperbolic prediction of impending doom. The last one leads to a climate of chaos. So, does it exist an institution that can check the information broadcast on the TV and can take sanction against media who purposely spread fake news?
Well, no, there's no such thing. What exists are fact-checking organizations. So you have factcheck.org, for instance, that does a very meticulous job of analyzing every statement by every politician and to check what they said, to verify the accuracy of what is being said. They also sometimes do a good job with contextualizing these statements to help us understand what it means. But the United States has a constitution that guarantees completely, or let's say almost completely, unrestricted freedom of speech. So there's no institution that will, knock on a newspaper's door and say, "Hey, what you're saying is disinformation, it's fake," because the Supreme Court, who is, the custodian of free speech, has been very explicit in the decisions that it issued that even fake news and even lies are free speech. So your First Amendment rights allow you to express yourself in the way that you want, even if you say something that is not true. So it would be completely impossible to even start imagining an entity or a government agency that would regulate disinformation. The problem is also that it's very difficult for academics, commentators, politicians to even agree on what disinformation is. So it would imply for us to have a very operational, a valid definition of disinformation in order to do that. And those are the two biggest challenges, and these are challenges that you cannot overcome, ever.
Okay, I see. Change is impossible to overcome in the USA. But in France, we do have some institutions regarding medias. So it leads us to my final question. As American phenomena often cross the Atlantic Ocean, do we have to fear this type of journalism, or is it inherent to the American mentality?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. It is inherent to, let's say, the brand of conservatism that has emerged since the 1950s, which is a much more fundamentalist kind of conservatism, more radical. It also has to do with the specificity of the US media system, which is overwhelmingly commercial, very deregulated, very little space for public media, and of course an infinite offer of programming, of media outlets. So our context, our media structure in France is a bit different because the government intervenes much more. It regulates the sector much more significantly, and it also regulates discourse. We don't have a First Amendment in France, so it gives more elbow room to the government to regulate what you can and what you can't say. If, for instance, Éric Zemmour said the same thing in the US, the things that he says in France, if he said them in the US, he would probably have never been condemned to paying any fine at all. That's a very specific specificity of the French system, that we regulate part of the public discourse because we consider that there are certain things that you cannot say, that there's a limit, that when you cross it, it's not your right to free speech or to your free expression, but it becomes a hate crime when you say something about Jews or Muslims or etc. etc. So what I would say, nonetheless, is that if you look at CNews, you could argue that in a way, the cable news, CNews, is or shares some similarities with Fox News, for instance. If you think of the aesthetic of outrage, the fact that it's not necessarily about ideas, but it's about emotion. It's about rising the temperature. It's about making people angry. It's about sensationalizing everything. In my view, this phenomenon is becoming more and more visible on some of CNews programs. So it always crosses the Atlantic, with some delay and probably at a lesser intensity, but it is getting to us in some form.
Okay, so thank you a lot for your answers, Mr. MORT. It was really precise and well explained. And I think we all learned a lot on the functioning of the media in the USA and how Trump chose them.